Welcome to Mental Healthy, the podcast where we share stories of the professionals and experts worldwide working in the mental health field. Here's your host, Dr. Kenyon Knapp.
Welcome, everyone, to the Mental Healthy Podcast. I'm glad to have you with us here today. I've got a great guest today, Dr. Jeremiah Sullins. Welcome to the program, Dr. Sullins.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I appreciate you being here. With new guests on the program, everyone's always curious about your background and where you're from and stuff like that. So could you give the listeners a little bit of a feel for your background and things like that?
Just a little bit of personal background. So I was actually born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee. And I actually stayed there and got all of my degrees, my undergraduate, my master's degree, and Ph.D. in experimental psychology at the University of Memphis. And that was back in 2010. And since then, I actually was an adjunct faculty and research scientist at the University of Memphis for a year or two. After that, I actually went and taught for a few years in the psychology department down at the University of Mobile. And then I left the University of Mobile and came to Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas back in 2014. And I've been here at Harding since 2014. I'm actually a professor of psychology and the director of the Center for Cognitive Sudies, which is kind of my research lab that I have here set up at Harding. And I've actually been working also at Liberty University online since 2012.
Wow, that's great. You and I are new to each other, but we actually have some paths that have crossed as far as these institutions and all, because I got my Ph.D. from Ole Miss, and I've known a few people at Harding, so it's a great university down there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, but I know with all of your research and all, you've done a lot of work in the area of guilt and shame as far as it relates to education and some other areas. As we talk about that, and that's sort of our topic for today, could you maybe differentiate, what's the difference between guilt and shame?
Sure. I think this is actually a really important distinction because even before I got into researching guilt and shame, which was about 8 years ago, actually, I really didn't give much thought into the differences between guilt and shame. I just kind of assumed that they were really one and the same. And I think a lot of non-psychologists assume that guilt and shame are the same. And even if you look at some of, just as an example, some of Freud's earlier writings when he's making this connection between guilt and neurosis, if you really start to dig into what he's describing, it sounds like he's describing shame more than guilt. But I don't think that distinction was made at the time. And even in some of the diagnostic manuals that you see even today, they use guilt and shame interchangeably. And so I think this is a really important distinction because they really put you on two different trajectories in terms of the impact on learning and pathologies, et cetera. But kind of simply put, shame is an emotion that involves a negative self-evaluation. So it's believing that something is actually wrong with you as a person. So people who are going through a shameful experience might describe themselves as feeling worthless, stupid, foolish, inadequate, or less than. It's really a painful sense of being fundamentally flawed. Guilt, on the other hand, is an internal response to something that you've done or something that you haven't done. So really one of the easiest ways to distinguish between shame and guilt is guilt is really thinking I did something bad, whereas shame is I am bad.
That is a good delineation. Yeah, I can totally see the difference between those. That's good. Now, and I know that there's other delineations too, even within shame. I've read some of the things you've written. You talk about the difference between trait shame versus state shame. Could you maybe explain that for the listeners, like what that means as well?
Sure. And so, so really at this point, we kind of are getting more into the weeds of looking into shame. But again, I think this is a really important distinction, as I'll talk about when we start getting into some of the findings from my research, because I think shame proneness is something that really is impactful in terms of mental health and learning. But so when we talk about shame proneness, which is also known as trait shame, This is actually a pervasive and persistent tendency to experience feelings of shame across a wide range of situations. And the reason it's important to make this distinction is because shame proneness has actually been shown to be linked with depression and a lack of empathy, a tendency to blame others, expressions of anger and hostility, low self-esteem, hopelessness, just to name a few. And so again, that's trait shame, shame proneness, this tendency to experience feelings of shame across a wide range of situations. State shame, on the other hand, is more of a kind of an in the moment shame, right? Mm-hmm. It's a temporary emotional response to specific events or circumstances.
That makes sense. I mean, one is more pervasive and the other one is more short term. Now, I know you've done a lot of research into the implications of this as the way it impacts a person with their education. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit I guess we'll dig in here a little bit of, what are the implications of these different kinds of shame and how does it affect educational outcomes?
Sure. And so I guess let me give you a little bit of context into why I got interested in shame, because it's something I don't know. Most people don't really give it much thought, even though I do believe that shame is kind of arguably at sort of pandemic levels, right? I mean, I feel like we all experience shame, but we live in a very kind of shame-phobic society. We talk about sort of feeling guilty about something that we've done. But in my opinion, if someone comes up to you and says, I'm feeling really shameful because of X, Y, or Z, you might think to yourself, wow, you must have really messed up, right? Because it's something that we're not very accepting of, and maybe tend to be a little bit judgmental when it comes to listening to someone talk about something they did that they're shameful about. I got interested in this really primarily because as a student myself, for a while, I really wasn't a great student, really because I didn't have a whole lot of direction in terms of what I wanted to do as a career. And so I remember thinking back in high school, for example, the teacher would sort of pass back these exams. And inevitably, I hadn't done as well as I would have liked to. And so I kind of quickly get my exam back and I flip it over and slide it under my notebook on my desk because everybody's kind of looking around to see what everybody else made, social comparison to try to make themselves feel better. And then, the teacher might immediately go into lecturing on new material. And I got to thinking to myself, like, what impact does that have on my ability to retain new information? In one sense, maybe I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm feeling really terrible. I don't want to feel like this again, so I need to course correct. Or could it be that I think to myself, well, I'm just stupid. I'm just not a good student. What's the point? And so that really kind of initiated my interest in researching what impact does shame have in an educational environment, because we know that shame can be triggered by just so many different things. I mean, it can be triggered by comparing yourself to others, having a high focus on performance, being a perfectionist. And shame has been linked with anxiety and depression and eating disorders and borderline personality disorder, somatic health complaints, addictions, PTSD, and suicidal ideation. So again, given all of that, I think this is an emotion that we need to better understand so that we can help people recognize and move forward constructively when they're experiencing this self-conscious emotion.
That makes a lot of sense. I have to go down a little bit of a rabbit trail here. I know since we both work here at Liberty and you work adjunct, but also full-time at Harding, and these are both, Christian colleges, I would hope, within the Christian community that the Christian worldview would help people to have a lower level of shame and feel a sense of, conviction about things we're doing wrong based on a Christian worldview, and then have lower levels of shame and cope better because, we believe in grace and mercy that the Bible talks about. But I know some Christians probably get all this confused and twisted, and they might create more shame for themselves than what God would intend. What have you found in your research in regards to how Christianity or maybe faith in general, how it's correlated with guilt and shame?
Right. And that's actually on the horizon. I'm actually in the process of collaborating with some of the faculty in our Bible department to develop and implement a shame resilience intervention that revolves around this Christian worldview, because I think you're absolutely correct in that, in theory, I think as Christians, we should be less shameful because we do believe in grace and forgiveness, and really feeling shameful. And, the way that I view it from a Christian worldview, feeling shameful is trying to pay a debt that's already been paid. You're feeling bad about maybe some sort of sinful behavior. But again, I'm not, condoning continuous sinful behavior, but we're human, we're imperfect, and we're going to mess up. But as a Christian, we should believe that, again, this is a debt that's been paid. I don't need to view myself, because if I believe in Scripture and I believe I've been made in the image of God, I don't need to view myself as being defective or less than or deformed or unworthy or anything like that. I mean, we're chosen, right? And so, but, yes, all of that in theory, I think, and that would be my prediction in terms of a Christian worldview on shame. But that's actually one of the things I'm like I said, I'm in the process of developing and testing. But not to go off on too much of a tangent. Sure. Obviously, intuition is not a replacement for empiricism. And so kind of similarly, back during the height of the COVID pandemic, I actually was a faculty supervisor on a study that was being done by one of our undergraduate psychology majors. And so as part of a study she was conducting, she wanted to look at the impact of religiosity on things like anxiety and depression during the COVID pandemic. And so kind of not a simple study. I mean, it was fundamentally sound. But essentially what she did was she just measured people's levels of religiosity using the Durrell, which is the Duke University Religion Index. And we dichotomized people to see, well, do they have high levels of religiosity or low levels of religiosity? And essentially, unfortunately, and surprisingly, what we found was even for those people who had high levels of religiosity, you would think during COVID, they would be less anxious and less depressed because they believe in God's plan. But that actually wasn't the case. We found no statistical differences in terms of anxiety and depression, and when you dichotomize high and low religion. And also, one more thing that I would like to throw in there also is I do believe that I think certain denominations might impact kind of feelings of shame, because kind of, for lack of a better term, if you're looking at sort of these legalistic sort of churches with fire and brimstone and rule-based and all of that sort of stuff, I mean, you might actually bring on more religious trauma, which could increase levels of trauma rather than a more kind of relationship-focused view of religion. So again, I don't know that for a fact, but it definitely is an empirical question. But I do strongly believe that we should look at Christianity versus other religions, but also even within Christianity, I think certain denominations would impact the level of shame that people are experiencing.
Okay. Well, Dr. Sullins, it strikes me that these topics of guilt and shame are sort of feeling kinds of words, which I would think would lend themselves to more of a qualitative kind of research. But is it possible for you to do this kind of research on these topics in a quantitative way as well?
Sure, that's a great question because, as I said, my Ph.D. is in experimental psychology. And so during my graduate training, I was trained as a quantitative researcher. So I'm a big fan of inferential statistics and generalization and things of that nature. And so I do think that qualitative research obviously brings a lot to the table. And I do think that it is an invaluable part of researching these types of emotions so that we can really get a deeper understanding of people's experiences as they're going through these emotions. But as I said, I want to understand how guilt and shame are operating in the majority of people and able to make generalizations. And in order to do that, we're going to have to collect larger sample sizes, right? So that we can make these generalizability or generalizable statements. And so, so there are certain measures out there that do lend themselves to a quantitative exploration of shame. And so two of them that I use in my lab consistently are what's called the TSCA, which was developed by June Tangney. That stands for the test of self-conscious affect. And this is a widely used psychological assessment designed to measure individual differences in proneness to various self-conscious emotions like shame and guilt. So it's composed of 16 hypothetical scenarios designed to elicit self-conscious emotions. And these scenarios cover a range of everyday situations, things like making a mistake at work or failing to fulfill a responsibility or receiving praise for some sort of accomplishment. And participants kind of rate these hypothetical situations on a 5-point scale. But the TSCA is used to measure guilt and shame proneness, among other things. And the other measure that I tend to use a lot in my lab is what's called the experiential shame scale. And this was developed by Janine Turner at Florida State University. And this is actually a measure of in-the-moment shame. So the experiential shame scale is composed of 11 items where individuals specify the number that best reflects their current feelings when contrasting two opposite word states. And so really just not going into the weeds of how I'm using these measures, but predominantly using these two measures, I have used two different methodologies in order to try to successfully induce and reliably measure shame in a laboratory. So having sort of randomized controlled trials. And so one of those methodologies is essentially bringing people into the lab and having them take sort of a fake aptitude test. I don't tell them it's a fake aptitude test, but as they're getting ready to take this test, I say, okay, this is a test that as a college student shouldn't be that difficult for you. And also it's been shown to be predictive of your overall intelligence. So I'm kind of setting them up for success. And then they get false feedback. Once they've completed the test, they get some textual feedback that basically says, you did horrible and everybody did so much better than you. And so not surprisingly, that does elicit significantly higher levels of state shame. And this might seem kind of a mean way to do it, but the reason that I use that particular methodology is because other research has shown that learning and assessments are events that spark a shame reaction, and feelings of shock are correlated with feelings of shame. And so that's why I did that methodology. And then a second methodology that I've actually started using recently is just a more sort of benign written shame induction protocol where participants are asked to think about experiences in their life in which they thought less of themselves because of something they did or because of how they were treated. And so, long story short, using these two methodologies with these two assessments, we've actually found that we have been able to elicit and measure significantly higher levels of state shame compared to various controls.
Oh, well, that's cool. It makes me think, that there is a long history of using deception in research in an ethical way, because it doesn't really cause any harm, long-term harm to do that. And I'm assuming that afterwards you would tell them at some point that it was an artificial situation to reduce shame or any kind of damage per se that self-perception may have caused.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it kind of goes without saying, but I say it anyways. We did get IRB approval for the study. But yeah, you're absolutely right. So here's my thinking on that, though. Two things. Number one, I don't know that in terms of the false feedback and the deception, my thinking on that is I don't believe that we're doing anything that doesn't naturally occur in a classroom. You take a test, you think you did well on the test, you get the test back. and you have some sort of perceived failure, which actually has some real world consequences. It impacts your ability to graduate in your career and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We have a very thorough debriefing where we make sure to say, okay, look, this says nothing about your intelligence or your abilities or your aptitude. This is the reason we felt like we had to use deception. And then we also give them the contact information for a local counseling center in case they feel like they need to follow up with someone afterwards.
Sure. Well, that sounds very thorough for an IRB. And I used to be in an IRB board, so that's the kind of thing that sounds perfect. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, going along with your research, I guess I'm curious as to what you found through that. Like when people felt that shame, I'm wondering, would that motivate them to do better in their schooling or their testing, or would that create that sense of failure, and then they would maybe have a self-fulfilling prophecy where they started to do more poorly because they thought they were ignorant or something like that?
Right. And so that's what I didn't know when I went into this, because I kind of liked these two, it's kind of like science in a lot of ways is sort of like a cage match between ideas where you want to kind of put these ideas to fight to the death and see which one comes out on top. And so I didn't know when I first started this. I thought to myself, might this serve as a motivator for people to do better moving forward so that they don't continue to feel bad about themselves? Or is it just going to push people further away from trying to learn, and are they just going to give up? And yeah, I didn't know. I've run several experiments now, kind of looking at the impact of shame and shame proneness and other individual differences and how this actually impacts education. And without going into the boring details, I'll just kind of give you the takeaway message. Essentially, what we found is an interaction, a really important interaction, though, between shame, state shame, and shame proneness. So more specifically, what we found was that shame alone, state shame alone, didn't seem to have much impact on how much people learned in the moment. But when we started looking at those people who were experiencing shame in the moment and whether or not they came into the experiment with a high versus low shame prone, that really seemed to be a fuller story, I guess. So more specifically, what we found was for the people that went through the shame induction protocol, if they had a high proneness to shame, they actually had significantly lower learning compared to those people who were experiencing state shame who had a low proneness to shame. So more specifically, participants with a low proneness to shame who were experiencing in the moment shame actually increased from pre-test to post-test by 26%. So that's like almost a 3-letter grade increase. And those with the high proneness to shame did learn, but they only increased by about 16%. So we're looking at about a 10% or a 1-letter grade difference between those with the high proneness to shame and those with the low proneness to shame. So I think that's a really important takeaway message, especially if you're an educator. You kind of need to consider these individual differences, and as you're passing these test grades back, and you know that this is a situation that's ripe for individuals to experience in the moment shame. For those that have a high proneness to shame, you're really going to lose those individuals moving forward.
That makes sense. I mean, when I hear you say it, it's the idea that if a person feels proneness toward shame or trait shame, that they would maybe give up more or things like that, or just not learn because of discouragement. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you were describing the difference between those who have trait shame and those who didn't, or were lower on that. What are some other differences you found between individuals on this? Like, I'm wondering things like, do older people have more shame, or younger people, or males versus females, or maybe other demographics that you might have studied?
So just also going back to the shame proneness in terms of those with a high proneness to shame, learning significantly less than those with a low proneness to shame. Just to revisit that for 1 second, I think it is intuitive, I believe, but I think what's going on is for people who have a high proneness to shame and then they're experiencing this in the moment shame, I think that these negative emotions are compromising individuals' cognitive availability. Right. So I think these situations that elicit strong emotions and a concern for well-being may be problematic in the sense that the extra processing capacity is required for sort of toning down emotions and for tuning back in on the task. And I think that might be one of the reasons why people with high shame proneness who are also experiencing in the moment shame are learning less. But this also aligns with other research that actually describes people's reaction to receiving information that maybe doesn't conform with their self-conceptions. So research has shown that after people recover from surprise, people will often rush to find ways to discredit or dismiss the feedback. And so sort of just all of this in a nutshell, what I think might be going on is that the failure feedback people are receiving sort of confirm the self-views of the high shame-prone students, but are dissonant with the self-views of the low shame-prone students. And so the dissonance could have made them feel uncomfortable, and they may have been eager to demonstrate their academic ability, but those with high shame-proneness, they just are thinking, okay, yeah, I told you so type of situation. Yeah. But yeah, to go back to your previous question, I do believe that individual differences, the kind of the running joke when anybody asks me a psychological question, my answer is always, it depends. Because there's never sort of a silver bullet when it comes to behavioral sciences and all of that. So there's actually sort of three or four individual differences that I look at, and I'll talk about these kind of briefly, and then feel free to ask any sort of follow-up questions. So I'm not going through all of these sort of all at once, but one of the individual differences that I'm really interested in is this idea of self-regulated learning. So for those who aren't familiar with self-regulated learning, it's really a self-directed and proactive process that involves using cognitive abilities to promote academic performance. So in other words, self-regulated learning is basically the process through which students take control of their own learning, right? So as they're going through the learning process, they're setting goals for themselves, they're monitoring their learning, they're evaluating their process. And not surprisingly, we know that students who self-regulate do generally across the board do better in academic settings than those who don't self-regulate during the learning process. And again, this is not surprising, but it's great to have empirical data to back this up. We found that students who are high in shame proneness have significantly lower self-regulatory abilities compared to those with a low shame proneness. And even more specifically, those who are high in shame proneness tend to have less self-efficacy in their abilities. They tend to be less likely to reflect on their learning, and they tend to put less effort into the learning process, which again makes perfect sense when we go back to and we think back to high shame-prone individuals are learning less, but a great piece of the puzzle that we also found, they're learning less, but they have lower self-efficacy, they're less likely to reflect on their learning, and they're putting less effort into the learning process. So it's a perfect intuitive narrative.
It does make sense. Well, you're getting into some really good practical applications here too, like when you talk about self-regulation and how that affects, learning and all. And I guess I'm thinking our listeners are largely professors and people in the mental health fields who are often practitioners. Is it possible to develop resiliency to shame or guilt? And like I'm thinking of the therapeutic applications of all your research.
Yeah. So the thing, one of the reasons that I'm trying to explore these individual differences, and also I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too much. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, obviously, but other things that I've actually looked at that I'm factoring in terms of developing resiliency interventions is in addition to self-regulation. As I've already mentioned, I'm really interested in shame proneness. I'm also interested in imposter phenomenon and levels of perfectionism. And so all of these things are sort of related, right? I kind of think of, obviously it's impossible to have three sides of one coin, but when I think of shame proneness and imposter phenomenon and perfectionism, I think of those all sort of being cousins with each other, right? I mean, they're all sort of related. And so yeah, you sort of see associations and correlations between shame proneness and imposter phenomenon. So I found in my own research a significant positive correlation between imposter phenomenon and shame proneness, which is a horrible place to live if you think about it, right? These are the people that when they fail, they're internalizing their failures, but when they succeed, they're externalizing their successes. They think it's based on circumstance and luck and being at the right place at the right time. So that, that's just not a good place to be. And so, all of that's to say, I've been developing over the last couple of years, I've been developing shame resilience interventions, not to eliminate shame. I think this is a really important thing here. I think that shame is there for a reason. I don't think that our goal as clinicians or counselors or researchers should be the total elimination of shame. It's kind of similar to like anger. I mean, I don't know that anger feels good, and I don't know, that it's something we necessarily want to happen, but I do think it can be advantageous, and so so I don't think we should be trying to do away or eliminate shame, but what I think we should be doing is to helping students identify shame and to deal with those feelings constructively so that they're able to move through a shameful experience. And so really one of the ways that I have focused on this initially, like I said, over the last couple of years, is through sort of a technical way of saying this, but it's attributional retraining. Which is essentially just trying to change how individuals attribute the causes of their successes and failures, right? So basically, as we're working through this intervention, we're trying to explain to people that, okay, here's what shame and guilt is, here's what they're about. Shame is an internal attribution, guilt is an external attribution. And so, it's largely focused on an academic setting. And so we're trying to explain to people, well, before you go to a professor and you talk about dropping a class or switching majors, think about, guilt and shame both make you feel bad, but why are you feeling bad, right? Did you fail that test because you had your phone out too much? Were you skipping class? Were you not taking notes? Were you not paying attention? Because all of those things are external, and those are kind of easily fixable. We don't want you to fail a test and think, well, I'm just not college material, right? The way that I try to explain it to people is it's a lot easier to change a behavior than it is to change a self. People are in therapy for years to try to change the way they think about themselves. And so we don't want people to have these shameful experiences. And so essentially what we have found, some promising results, actually. So what we have found in these sort of initial analyses is statistically significant increases in learners' perceived importance of recognizing shame, confidence in their ability to recognize shame, confidence in their ability to distinguish between shame and guilt, confidence in their ability to recover from a shame experience, and comfort levels in sharing experiences in shame. So again, they're beginning to understand the differences between shame and guilt, and they're getting more comfortable in talking about shame, which according to Brene Brown, who sort of is the figurehead when it comes to shame, she argues that kind of speaking shame is one of the best tools we have against shame. And so sort of my next plan of attack is essentially to take this resiliency intervention that seems to be effective, at least when you look at the perceptions of the people who have gone through the intervention, and to put the rubber to the road, so to speak, and to see if it actually leads to sort of any sort of behavioral changes in state shame and shame proneness.
This all makes great sense to me. Like I hear about the attributional retraining and all that, which is sort of CBT, applied to this topic, which of course has tons of, research efficacy over the years. That's great. The one thing I think of when I hear about attributional retraining is we need to have correct attributions to have an accurate understanding of should we feel guilt or responsibility for something, or should we externalize it? And knowing where that balance is wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so even though this is kind of getting outside of my lane a little bit as a quantitative researcher, I'm actually in the process of doing sort of a mixed method study where I am gathering a small number of follow-up interviews with some of the people who have gone through the intervention. And I think you're absolutely right. This is something that is sort of lost on a lot of students. You know, the ones that have gone through the intervention, they basically have sort of anecdotally said, you know, this has been great because in the past I've gone into a class and I have failed a test and I've thought to myself, like, you're so stupid. And now, you know, I maybe I fail a test and I'm thinking to myself, I don't feel good. And when you fail a test, arguably you shouldn't feel good. But the reason is, why aren't you feeling good? And I think if we can get people to move away from internalizing these failures in terms of like blaming themselves for their failures, and then maybe trying to have the wisdom, as you said, to identify what exactly is responsible for this failure, and let me focus on what it is I'm able to change. I think that's something that's really important for the students to understand.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know, as I'm hearing you talk, I'm just sort of imagining, and this is often the case, that there's some listeners right now on the podcast who are going, this is so interesting. This is great. Like, I want to learn more about this or whatever. And I'm wondering, are there any resources you would recommend for a person to read or get about this topic? Or maybe have you written any journal articles or books or anything like that about this whole topic?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've got have a paper that I actually just published in the last few months that I would be happy to send you the link for. So yeah, and I've got a lab website where I've got a lot of publications that I include on the lab website, and so I'm definitely happy to share those resources. But also not to put the focus entirely on myself, because I don't want to do that. I mean, there are a lot of other individuals that I have. A lot of other individuals that I have found to be extremely intelligent in this area that some of your listeners might be interested in. So James Huff is an individual. There's also Will Bynum at Duke, who has been really valuable, and June Tangney and Janine Turner. Those are a few names that your listeners might be interested in. So again, James Huff, Will Bynum, June Tangney, and Janine Turner. So yeah, if you just do a sort of a Google search of me or any of those individuals, I think you'll be kind of overwhelmed. But I will say this, I mean, just kind of quickly, the majority of the research that's out there, especially by those individuals that I've mentioned, which is why I got interested in doing what I'm doing, is a lot of them either approach shame from a qualitative perspective, which again does add value to does add to the story. So it's either been qualitative in nature, or a lot of the research that's been done on shame really has lacked. A study of shame in the learning community has really been lacking. I mean, there's been a lot of research on shame in terms of body shaming and abuse, alcoholism, addiction, all of that sort of stuff. And so I'm not saying that people haven't researched shame, but really there's a lacking in terms of the impact that shame and shame proneness have in the educational setting, which is where I'm trying to fill that gap through the research that I'm currently conducting.
Well, that sounds great. Let me ask this too. We went over a number of questions that I had for you and all, but sometimes I leave out an important topic that you wish, I wish we would have mentioned that during the podcast. Is there any final thoughts or anything on your heart or mind that you'd want the listeners to share before we wrap it up today?
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I would like to add, because this is something that I've actually, I don't claim to be an expert in this area, but one thing that I've started looking at in terms of my own research and including that, as I briefly touched on, is this idea of perfectionism, because the thing is when you go into a job interview, it's so cliche for someone to say, well, do you have the self-awareness to identify a weakness that you might have? And so a cliche response might be, well, I'm a perfectionist, right? That's one of these things that you hear a lot of people might say is their weakness. And I think, for your audience, I wanted to maybe educate them on the difference between perfectionism and conscientiousness, because when non-psychologists talk about perfectionism, they're thinking that this is like a strong desire to do something well. And that's being conscientious. That's not being a perfectionist. When psychologists talk about perfectionism, we're talking about a risk factor for clinical disorders, right? Perfectionism has been associated with general anxiety disorder, social anxiety, eating disorder, and suicidal thoughts. I mean, whereas conscientiousness is this strong desire to do something well, perfectionism is a personality trait that's characterized by striving for flawlessness and setting excessively high performance standards and being overly critical of oneself and others. And so, again, without going into the boring details, in some of my preliminary findings, I'm not surprisingly finding relationships between sort of shame proneness and perfectionism, because these are individuals that are setting these unrealistic, unattainable goals for themselves, and they're not meeting them, and then they're turning around and feeling bad about who they are because they were unable to meet those goals. And so I don't think perfectionism is a good trait. Being conscientious is good, but being a perfectionist is not a good thing necessarily.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense to me as well. But, well, I'll tell you what, you mentioned that paper in your website. So when we post this podcast, I'll make sure that we get the link to your paper and your website. So the listeners, you can see that when you look us up, you'll be able to click on that and see that paper and website. But thank you, Dr. Jeremiah Sullins, so much for joining me on the podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really appreciative of giving me the platform to talk about some of the exciting research that I've been doing over almost the last decade. But I appreciate the opportunity to get the word out there.
Absolutely. I look forward to reading more of what you do. It sounds great. So listeners, thank you as well for joining us today on the Mental Healthy Podcast. I look forward to having more great guests like Dr. Sullins on the program in the future, and I hope you can join us as well. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mental Healthy. If you want to hear more episodes, please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts and head to linktree.com/mentalhealthypodcast for all of our social media platforms with the latest mental healthy content. If you have a story to share that relates to what we discussed in this episode or any other episode, please contact us at mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. That's mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless.